In the winter of 1846, dozens of American families became trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains. By Christmas, they had eaten their oxen. By January, they were boiling animal hides for food. And before the snow melted, some would begin eating the dead. The story would become one of the darkest survival disasters in American history. But the Donner Party did not begin as a horror story. It began as a shortcut. In the spring of 1846, the American West still existed more as an idea than a place. California belonged to Mexico. Oregon was disputed territory. Most Americans would never see the Pacific Ocean. But thousands of settlers were already moving west anyway. The Oregon Trail had become a moving road of wagons, livestock, and families crossing the continent. Some traveled for land, some for money. Some simply believed that a better life existed somewhere beyond the plains. The Donner Party was one of those groups. The families were not poor drifters. Many were skilled craftsmen, farmers, business owners. George Donner was 62 years old, respected, experienced, and wealthy enough to lead his own wagon company. James Reed owned a successful business in Illinois. He traveled with his wife Margaret, 4 children, and his elderly mother-in-law, so fragile she died before they even reached Wyoming. Most of the travelers believed they were heading toward opportunity. They had mortgaged farms, sold businesses, said goodbye to people they would never see again. They were not foolish people. They were hopeful ones. Instead, they were driving directly toward one of the worst winters in American history. The wagon train left Springfield, Illinois in April of 1846. At first, the journey followed the same route thousands of emigrants had already used. But near Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming, they made a decision that would destroy them. A man named Lansford Hastings had been promoting a shortcut to California. It became known as the Hastings Cutoff. Hastings claimed the route would save time by cutting south around the Great Salt Lake. He had barely traveled the route himself. Most experienced trail guides warned against it, but California fever was spreading across the wagon trails, and the idea of reaching the coast faster proved impossible to resist. There was also a letter. Hastings had left a note at Fort Bridger promising to personally guide any wagon train that took his cutoff. The note was reassuring. It was also a lie. Hastings was already far ahead with another group and would never return to guide them. The Donner Party turned south. Almost immediately, everything slowed down. The shortcut crossed difficult mountain terrain that had never been cleared for wagons. Trees had to be cut by hand. It took 3 days of brutal labor just to clear a single canyon. Wagons were dragged through narrow, rocky passes with ropes. Progress collapsed from miles per day to barely a mile at all. Weeks disappeared. By the time the Donner Party finally rejoined the main California trail, the shortcut had cost them nearly 3 weeks they could not afford to lose. And winter was already moving toward the Sierra Nevada. The worst section of the cutoff still lay ahead. To rejoin the California Trail, the emigrants needed to cross the Great Salt Lake Desert. Nearly 80 miles of dry salt flats. No trees, no shade, almost no fresh water. Hastings had told them the crossing would take 2 days. It took 6. The crossing destroyed them. Wagon wheels sank into salt mud beneath the surface crust. Oxen collapsed from dehydration. Animals wandered away during the night, driven mad by thirst, and never returned. The heat became unbearable during the day. At night, the temperature dropped so fast that survivors could hear the salt crust cracking around them in the darkness. One traveler later described abandoned wagons scattered across the desert beside dead livestock already rotting in the sun. The Reeds lost all 4 of their wagons crossing the desert. Everything they owned, furniture, food, tools, keepsakes from their old life in Illinois, was left behind in the salt. The emigrants were forced to leave behind food, tools, and supplies simply to keep moving. By the time the Donner Party finally escaped the desert, they had lost precious weeks and precious oxen. They were behind schedule, they were running low on food, and the Sierra Nevada still lay ahead. The shortcut had become a trap. In October of 1846, the Donner Party finally reached the Sierra Nevada mountains. They were dangerously late, but they were close. The pass was only days away. Experienced wagon companies usually crossed the mountains before the first autumn storms. The Donner Party entered in late October. Then the snow came.
On October 20th, 1846, an exceptionally early and exceptionally heavy snowstorm slammed into the Sierra Nevada. The mountain pass ahead disappeared beneath drifts too deep for wagons to move through. The emigrants attempted to push forward anyway. They failed almost immediately. Oxen collapsed in the snow, wheels froze into ice, visibility vanished in the storm. One party turned back, then another. The road west was gone. The road east was gone too. The Donner Party was trapped. 81 men, women, and children, buried in snow in the mountains, with barely enough food to last a month. The emigrants built shelters near a frozen lake high in the mountains. Today it is called Donner Lake. At the time, it was simply wilderness and buried under snow. Some families stayed in crude cabins built from pine logs. 3 families sharing walls, sharing heat, sharing silence. Others constructed tents from wagon covers and tree branches.
The Donner families themselves, George and his brother Jacob, were camped 6 miles away at a place called Alder Creek, too far from the lake to reach the main cabins. They would spend the entire winter separated from the rest of the party. The snow continued falling. Within weeks, drifts reached the roofs of the cabins. Paths between shelters disappeared beneath walls of snow taller than a man. The lake froze solid. The mountains vanished behind white storms and silence. No one was coming. Inside the cabins, food supplies began disappearing faster than anyone had planned. First, the emigrants slaughtered their remaining oxen, then the dogs, then boiled strips of animal hide, the same hides used to cover wagon frames, to create something resembling soup. Some survivors crushed animal bones into powder and mixed them into boiling water, simply to trick the stomach into feeling full for a few moments. Children cried from hunger through the night. Adults grew too weak to stand for long periods. One survivor later remembered people sitting silently for hours because movement wasted energy. Another described hearing trees crack in the freezing darkness outside, while starving families lay awake inside the cabins, unable to sleep. The snow trapped smoke inside the shelters. Clothing froze stiff overnight. Blankets became damp from melted snow and never properly dried again. Disease began spreading through the camps. Some emigrants developed snow blindness from the glare reflecting across the mountains. Others became delirious from starvation. One man reportedly wandered barefoot into the snow during the night in a confused attempt to find food. He never returned. Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant traveling with his wife and 7 children, kept a diary throughout the winter. It is the only document written in real time from inside the camps. His entries are brief, almost clinical.
The diary of a man trying to hold on to reason while everything around him collapsed. November 21st. Froze hard last night. Beautiful day. Stanton here yet. Hard to get wood. December 1st. Still snowing. Wind west. Murphy's folks or Keysburg can't eat hides. December 25th. Christmas. Breen wrote simply, "Offered our prayers to God this cherry mass morning. The prospect is appalling, but hope in God. Amen." Outside, the temperature kept falling. By December, the situation had become impossible. A small group decided to attempt an escape through the mountains on homemade snowshoes, strips of wood and oxen hide, lashed together by people who had never used snowshoes before. The group included 15 people, 10 men and 5 women. History would later remember them as the Forlorn Hope. They left December 16th, carrying 6 days of food. Snow reached deeper than their waists. Blizzards erased landmarks within minutes. The travellers became lost almost immediately. At night, they slept directly on the snow, beneath makeshift shelters built from branches, huddled together for heat that barely existed. The cold never stopped. On the 4th day, a blizzard pinned them down for 2 days. They burned the last of their matches staying warm. Some collapsed from exhaustion and froze where they fell. Others wandered through the snow, delirious from starvation. One man, Charles Stanton, who had voluntarily gone ahead weeks earlier to bring food back to the trapped party, sat down in the snow, lit his pipe, and told the others to go on without him. They obeyed. He was never seen again. Their snowshoes broke repeatedly on hidden rocks beneath the surface. Several members could no longer feel their feet. By the 2nd week, some travelers had become too weak to walk without support. Then, the food ran out completely. The survivors faced a decision they had hoped never to make. According to later accounts, the dead were no longer buried. Their bodies became food for the living. The survivors later insisted that no one had been murdered, that they had eaten only those who had already died. Some accounts have been disputed, others have been confirmed by multiple witnesses. What is not disputed is this: they kept walking. After 33 days in the snow, 7 survivors, 2 men and all 5 women, stumbled into a Native American settlement in the Sacramento Valley. The Native Americans gave them what they had: acorns, grass, pine nuts. And word finally reached Sutter's Fort that the Donner Party was trapped in the mountains. The first rescue party left Sutter's Fort on January 31st, 1847. It was not easy to find men willing to go. The mountains in winter were not a place anyone entered voluntarily. The rescuers traveled on foot through snow that in places reached 15 feet deep. On February 18th, 19 days after leaving the fort, 7 men finally reached Donner Lake. What they found shocked even experienced frontiersmen. The cabins were dark and half buried beneath snow. The only way in was through a hole in the roof. Starving survivors moved slowly through the camp wrapped in blankets and animal skins. Children with hollow faces sat beside fires too weak to melt the cold inside the cabins. One rescuer later wrote that the survivors were crying and laughing at the same time when they realized help had finally arrived. Human bones were found near some shelters. The rescuers could not save everyone immediately. They simply did not have enough food or enough strength to move all the survivors through the mountains at once. They took 23 people, mostly children, and began moving west. The weakest emigrants had to be left behind while rescue parties returned with more supplies. Several died waiting. Mothers were sometimes forced to watch rescuers carry away only some of their children, leaving others behind, because the rescuers did not have the strength to carry them all. James Reed, who had been expelled from the Donner Party months earlier for killing a man in a dispute, had made it to California and spent the winter raising money for a rescue mission. He led the second rescue party back into the mountains in February. He was reunited with his wife and children on the trail coming down. They had been evacuated by the first party. He kept going up. A man named John Stark became one of the heroes of the third rescue in March of 1847. Stark carried 9 children down the mountain on his back, 2 at a time, going back for each one. One of those children later said the rescue owed itself to nobody but God and Stark and the Virgin Mary. 4 rescue parties in total crossed the mountains between February and April of 1847. The 4th and final rescue party reached the camps in mid-April of 1847. The snow had begun melting. The camp was exposed. What the rescuers found would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Human remains in varying states, bones, body parts, evidence of what had sustained the survivors through the winter. One rescuer described a scene of human bodies terribly mutilated, legs, arms, and skulls scattered in every direction. And amid the wreckage, one man was still alive. Louis Kessberg, a German immigrant who had been unable to walk since early in the winter due to a leg injury. He was found alone in the ruins of the camp, surrounded by the remains of those who had not survived. The rescuers were convinced Kessberg had killed people to survive. He was put on trial. He was never convicted. Kessberg spent the rest of his life insisting he had murdered no one, that he had only done what he had to do to survive. He was never believed.
He died in Sacramento in 1895, nearly 50 years after the winter at Donner Lake, still carrying what he had done, or what people believed he had done, as a weight no amount of time could lift. Of the 81 people trapped at Donner Lake and Alder Creek that winter, 45 survived. 36 died, most of them men, most of them adults. The pattern of death was not random. Women survived at a higher rate than men. Children between 6 and 14 survived at a higher rate than infants or adults over 45. Researchers studying the Donner Party would later identify it as one of history's clearest case studies in survival under extreme conditions. But the survivors themselves were not interested in being case studies. They were people who had watched family members die, who had made choices no human being should ever have to make, and who now had to live in a world that knew what they had done. The story spread fast. Virginia Reed, 13 years old during the winter, wrote a letter to her cousin in Illinois in May of 1847. She wrote, "Never take no cut-offs and hurry along as fast as you can." 12-year-old Patty Reed wrote to another cousin, "Oh Mary, I have not wrote you half of the trouble we have had, but I have wrote you enough to let you know that you don't know what trouble is." She added, "Thank God we have all got through. We were the only family that did not eat human flesh." Mary Murphy, 13 years old, became an orphan when her parents died at the lake. 3 months after her rescue, with nowhere to go and no one to care for her, she married a man she barely knew. She wrote in 1847, "I hope I shall not live long, for I am tired of this troublesome world, and I want to go to my mother." She survived, remarried, founded a city. Mary Graves, 20 years old when rescued, was also left an orphan, also married within months. Her new husband was murdered the following year. She said, "I wish I could cry, but I cannot. If I could forget the tragedy, perhaps I would know how to cry again." George Donner, whose name the party carried, died at Alder Creek in late April, just as the last rescue parties were reaching the camp. His wife Tamsin refused to leave him. She stayed at his side and nursed him through his final days. When he died, Tamsin could have still been rescued. The rescuers were still in the mountains. She chose not to go. She was found dead at the camps. She was 45 years old. Their 5 children, orphaned, some of them barely old enough to walk, were taken in by strangers and grew up in California. One of them, Eliza Donner, was 3 years old when her parents died in the snow. She spent her entire adult life reconstructing what had happened. In 1911, 65 years later, she published her account. She had not forgotten anything.
The survivors of the Donner Party arrived in California as strangers. Some were celebrated, most were avoided. The camps on the mountain, referred to in newspapers as Cannibal Camp, became a kind of spectacle. People travelled to see the site. Journalists wrote articles. The story was told and retold, each version slightly more sensational than the last. The survivors lived with that, every day. Some spoke about what happened, some never did. James Reed, who had been expelled from the party before the winter, who had led 2 rescue missions, who had saved dozens of lives, settled in San Jose and became prosperous in the gold rush. The city named streets after his family. He died in 1874. Patrick Breen, who had kept the only diary written inside the camps, settled with his wife and all 7 of his children intact. The entire Breen family had survived. They purchased a former Mexican governor's property in San Juan Bautista and ran it as an inn. The Breen's youngest daughter, Isabella, was 1 year old during the winter of 1846.
She was the last survivor of the Donner Party. She died in San Francisco on March 25, 1935, almost 90 years after the snow came. She had never spoken publicly about the winter. She had been too young to remember it. But she had carried it anyway, in the fact of her survival, in the story that attached itself to her name, in the questions people asked when they found out who she was. The pass through the Sierra Nevada where the Donner Party was trapped is still there. It is called Donner Pass. State Route 80 runs through it today, a highway carrying thousands of cars every day across the same mountains that stopped 81 people and killed 36 of them in the winter of 1846. The highway occasionally closes in winter due to heavy snowfall. There is a detail about Lansford Hastings, the man who invented the cutoff, that stays with you once you know it.
He was not in the mountains when the Donner Party was trapped.
He was in California, safe, warm. He had promoted a route he had barely traveled to people who trusted him with their lives. He had left a letter promising to guide them personally, and then abandoned them before they even started. He was never held accountable. He spent the years after the disaster promoting other schemes, a Confederate colony in Brazil during the Civil War, various land ventures. He died in obscurity around 1875. History remembers the Donner Party. It barely remembers Lansford Hastings. And that asymmetry, the gap between who caused something and who suffered for it, is perhaps the truest thing this story has to say. The families who died in the snow were not reckless. They were not stupid. They followed a map drawn by a man who had never walked the road he was selling.
They trusted the promise of a shortcut in a country that was built on the idea that shortcuts exist. Virginia Reed understood this. She was 13 years old when she wrote those words to her cousin. Never take no cut-offs. Hurry along as fast as you can. She could not have known that she was writing the only lesson this story had to offer. But she was.